Hello and welcome. I am your host, and this is 35 Fox Talks. Today we're talking about a topic that is at the advanced levels of combat operations, and therefore also at the advanced levels of IPB Steps 3 and 4. Evaluate the threat and evaluate threat COAs, respectively. It is also extremely reliant on accurate IPB Steps 1 and 2, define the battlefield environment, and define the effects of the battlefield, respectively. The topic is the Combined Arms Breach. Now, we're talking about combined arms breaching today because, for the past few months, it has come up in conversations over and over again, mainly because a lot of analysts are being fed the narratives of media and think tank pieces to believe that the Ukrainian army is terrible at combined arms warfare, or that the Ukrainian and Russian armies are proving combined arms breaching is no longer effective on the modern battlefield, and both are just flat dead wrong. Why? Because to come to those conclusions, you have to ignore the history of combined arms breaching and the reasons NATO dove headfirst into air-land battle. Now, some of you will ask, what's the risk to thinking the combined arms breach is ineffective, dead, or needs new innovative weapons and strategies to succeed? The risk is that as a 35 Fox, you will generate inaccurate enemy COAs based on biases of their capabilities, required capabilities, and the effects of the modern battlefield on operations. These inaccuracies then result in battlefield mistakes and lost lives. So, with that sobering thought, let's look at what a combined arms breach is. Normally, we'd break out the doctrine here, but it makes a lot more sense when we speak plainly. A combined arms breach is when the commanders of a force on the offense run into a really tough defense of the opposing force. The defenses are so good they cannot be overcome by just assaulting with infantry or armor. The defenses can only be overcome by combining all available and appropriate. Tactical nukes are an example of not appropriate warfighting capabilities from the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, and Space Force against a focused area of the defensive line. If you're a history nerd, this should sound a lot like Blitzkrieg, Schwerpunkt, Bewegungskrieg, deep operations, deep battle, etc., etc. And that's because it is. In principle, all of these are the same thoughts written down by various surviving World War I commanders in different nations as their armies rebuilt and prepared for World War II. Now, modern lore has us believe that World War II ushered in the modern age of mechanized warfare with armored forces racing through defensive lines and forcing an all-out rout of enemy forces. The reality was very different. Nearly all operations were months-long, hard, grueling slugfests with only a few exceptions like Germany's breach of the French Maginot Line in 1940. For 99% of the war, combined arms maneuvering and breaching required ammunition expenditure that was astronomical and casualties that were atrociously high. Critical to almost every successful penetration of a prepared defense in depth was air superiority, something the Ukrainians and Russians both lack. This means the Ukrainian battlefield has more in common with the World War I battlefield than it does World War II. Air power gets you long-range ISR, long-range strike capability, and massed firepower, all of which are required for a successful breach. So a force devoid of air parity, let alone air superiority, is by default at a disadvantage. This is especially true when we disabuse ourselves of another misconception, that defensive lines are only 1 to 2 kilometers thick, and once penetrated, an enemy is compelled to retreat. This misconception in the Western mind sort of took hold after the Gulf War and Operation Iraqi Freedom I. Young soldiers got accustomed to the idea of breaching a border berm and charging about an enemy's countryside. It's only been reinforced since then by short-duration combined arms training exercises where training objectives need to be completed inside of a 14-day exercise window. So, the opposing force can never be too dug in or put up too much resistance. Plus, there's not an endless expansive training area, so defenses cannot be built kilometers upon kilometers deep. This all results in Allied soldiers becoming too comfortable with the idea of breaching a relatively shallow defensive line inside of a 2-week period with just one brigade, a lot of clearing vehicles, and an enemy who will fight hard until the training objective needs to be met. Oh, and of course, the Allies will have air superiority and close air support to prevent massing and counterattacks by the adversary. When we recenter ourselves on large-scale combat operations against a pure adversary, like what the Ukrainians are experiencing, we find sobering lessons from history. Let's explore two, one based on land and one on maritime littoral. The Siegfried Line, or West Wall. In the summer of 1944, the German army in France no longer existed, and the Soviet Union was collapsing Germany's Eastern Front, so it logically follows that with air supremacy and mechanized divisions rolling across France, the U.S. Army should have been able to stroll into Germany. Instead, what remained of the German Western Front Army occupied old border fortifications 500 kilometers long and averaging 5 kilometers deep. Against 6 U.S. and U.K. field armies, each army comprised of 2 to 4 corps, each corps composed of 2 to 5 divisions, you get the idea, the Germans managed to hold the entire Western Front at a standstill for 6 months, causing 150,000 casualties, or roughly 8 U.S. divisions worth of combat power, launched the Battle of the Bulge counteroffensive, adding another 83,000 casualties and thousands of vehicles destroyed, and forced many U.S. Army corps to expend 3,500, 12,500, 15,000 rounds of artillery per day. Over that entire 6-month period, Allied forces penetrated Siegfried Line fortifications multiple times, at the Aachen Gap and Hürtgen Forest, only to be caught in between defensive belts and driven back by withering artillery fire and counterattacks. This ground and air domain historical example has a lot of similarities to the Ukrainian front, with one glaring exception. The Allies had air supremacy, and the fight was still that savage and still required constant combined arms breaching. Our second example takes a skin-deep look at penetrating a ground-air maritime defense around the island of Guadalcanal, which has a lot of parallels to possible PRC Taiwan scenarios. Here we see that from August of 1942 to April of 1943, 9 months, the US and Japan fought over this multi-domain combined arms breach, this joint forcible entry, JFAO, this 1940s version of disintegrating A2AD. 9 months of fighting cost 14,800 Allied casualties, 19,200 Japanese casualties, 111 ships, and over 1,400 aircraft for just one jungle-covered island with a small port and airstrip. This example not only shows us how complex and hard it is to execute a ground-air maritime operation over 10,000 kilometers away from home bases, it shows how long it takes pure great powers to execute multi-domain combined arms breaching. It is not fast, it is not clean, and no one is compelled to give up their position just because the enemy creates small lodgements. Lodgements can be contained, isolated, defeated, and destroyed. As U.S. Civil War Union General Ulysses S. Grant once said, "In every battle there comes a time when both sides consider themselves beaten. Then whoever continues the attack wins." Now, this second example, built around the World War II campaign of Guadalcanal, provides us a convenient transition point. Because while we've been talking about combined arms breaching, we've also been talking about penetrating A2AD. We've started talking about multi-domain operations. In 1942, the United States had to disaggregate, penetrate, and defeat the forward A2AD line of the Japanese. The Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines all had to fight for 9 months to penetrate the first line of Imperial Japan's national defensive position. Likewise, in Europe, the Allies had to penetrate Nazi Germany's A2AD line in order to enter Germany and end the war. From both of these examples, we can derive the following larger lessons learned. 1. Peer-on-peer conflicts always come down to high attrition and battles of will. 2. After will, it is a battle of logistics. The force that can replace losses the most efficiently and sustain costs the longest will inevitably win. 3. All defenses are built to be penetrated. As U.S. World War II General George S. Patton said, "Fixed fortifications are a monument to man's stupidity. A good defense is elastic. It gives until enemy logistics or will is exhausted, and then snaps back in a counterattack. Remember, every bridgehead, airhead, beachhead, and lodgement can be contained, isolated, defeated, and destroyed." 4. Sustaining a penetration, such as Guadalcanal, is harder than breaching the defensive line. A pure adversary will do all they can to contain, isolate, defeat, and destroy a lodgement. There is no such thing as one and done. 5. Lodgements are choke points. They are engagement areas and kill boxes made by the very force trying to break through the defensive line. It is a small, narrow area where the enemy knows the attacker is funneling through. 6. Therefore, breaching forces suffer high casualties. Once they breach, 9 times out of 10, they require the unit to be completely rebuilt. 7. To conduct a combined arms breach or A2AD penetration, it requires a crap ton of expenditure of ammunition and exquisite capabilities. 8. Combined arms breaching is a protracted tactical engagement. Penetrating A2AD is a protracted operation or campaign. Now, all of those lessons learned were in the 1940s. In today's operational environment, command, control, communications, computers, cyber, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, C5ISR, has removed a lot of the old fog of war. This means both allies and adversaries do less guessing on what is happening and more shooting. And speaking of shooting, it has become both longer in range and more precise. In the olden days, forces could hide half a day's drive or march from the front line and charge into battle with unguided artillery shells landing randomly about them. Now those forces are immediately seen or reported on and struck with multiple high explosives that know where you're at just as much as your phone does. What's more, all those logistics bases and ports deep in the rear lines can be struck as well, causing a loss of critical logistics. Of course, all this ISR saturation and increased weapons lethality means more risks and more losses. With that said, as a 35 Fox, how should you envision all of this? 1. Until something changes in the OE, combined arms breaching and A2AD penetrations are the same thing. The difference is the scale and complexity of the force. Combined arms breaching is a tactical action coordinated at the operational level. A2AD is an operational action coordinated at the theater strategic level. 2. When conducting COA development or analysis, the Blue Force or Red Force needs to abide by the following tenets. A. Effective intelligence to prepare the battle plan. B. An ability to execute the breaching fundamentals. C. A capability to organize breaching organizations. D. An ability to mass people, capabilities, logistics, etc. E. The ability to synchronize multiple formations, assets, and the reactions of them to unforeseen occurrences. Expect the unexpected and be able to respond, not be paralyzed. Then, when executing a breach, the Blue Forces or Red Forces commander needs to have a support force suppress and obscure enemy effects in and around the point of the breach or reduction area. The breach force must secure and reduce enemy defensive emplacements along with securing and marking safe travel paths for follow-on forces. The assault force must then exploit the hole in the defense and seize some kind of feature. It must seize a lodgment. From there, the attacking force must fight to maintain this dent and outflank the enemy before new prepared defensive lines are constructed. All of that must be done while both sides are shooting at each other and messing with communications capabilities. So now we come back to our question. Are the Ukrainians bad at combined arms breaching, or have the Ukrainians and Russians proved combined arms breaches ineffective? The answer is, the Ukrainians and the Russians have verified what every Army lesson learned has said since the end of World War I. The only way to successfully breach through a defensive belt is the combined arms way. But when all things are equal between combatants, they will combined arms breach each other until one of them finally cracks. Either the will to fight will break, almost never happening by the way, or the communications and logistics networks will break, which is almost always the thing that breaks. Just about the only time combined arms breaching magically opens a hole that an entire army can drive through to victory on is when one side has a definitive overmatch against the other side. Like when the Allied Air Force could bomb World War II Europe at will, or the Allied Navy could shell, bomb, and starve out every Japanese-held island, or the U.S. Air Force ended the Iraqi Air Force in the first 30 seconds of the Gulf War and Operation Iraqi Freedom. In the Ukraine war, the combined arms breach is performing as expected given the COFAMs. As a 35 Fox, you should observe and learn that what you are seeing is the reality of LSCO, and that without a joint all-domain overmatch on the side of Blue 4, your COA development and analysis should help your commanders to expect similar results, regardless of being at a theater army or a brigade combat team. And with all of those sobering thoughts, stay safe and God bless out there.